Good evening and welcome. Tonight, let the world grow quiet around you, and let me carry you gently back across the sand of 5,000 years, to the oldest and strangest and most beautiful kingdom the world has ever known. Tonight, we are going to Egypt. Not the Egypt of guidebooks and crowds, but the living land itself, in the long ages when the pharaohs ruled and the gods walked among the temples, and the great river ran gold at dawn as it does in this very picture. So make yourself comfortable. Let your shoulders soften and your breathing slow. There is nothing you need to do now but listen and drift and let the ancient river carry you towards sleep. Before us lies the Nile at dawn. It is a wide, calm ribbon of water, shining like poured gold under a soft pink sky, and along its banks the tall papyrus reeds stand perfectly still. Small boats with white sails drift on the current, and far away, at the very edge of the light, the great pyramids rise faint and blue against the morning. This is the land the ancient Egyptians called Kemet, the Black Land, and its whole long story begins here with this river. Everything in Egypt was the gift of the Nile. Look down upon the land from above and you would see it at once. A narrow ribbon of brilliant green, fields and palm groves crowded along both banks of the Blue River, and beyond that green edge, nothing but endless golden desert stretching away to the horizon in every direction. The Egyptians had two names for their world. The Black Land was the dark, rich soil beside the water, where everything grew. The Red Land was the desert beyond, empty and burning, the country of the dead. Life in Egypt was lived on that thin green thread between them, and the whole civilization pressed close to the water, as a sleeping child presses close to warmth. Every year, the river gave Egypt a miracle. In the heat of summer, far away in the mountains of the south, the rains would fall, and the Nile would slowly rise. It would spread wide and glittering across the fields, until the palm trees stood in shallow water and the whole valley became a shining lake. The farmers did not fear this flood. They welcomed it. For when the water drew back, it left behind a fresh layer of dark, fertile mud, and in that mud everything they planted grew tall and green. This was the rhythm of Egyptian life, patient and certain, repeating year after year for thousands of years. The river rose, the river fell, and the land was made new. The Egyptians measured their whole year by it, dividing time into three great seasons. The season of the flood, when the fields lay beneath the shining water and there was no farming to be done. The season of growing, when the waters drew back and the seed was sown in the fresh dark mud. And the season of harvest, when the grain was cut and gathered and the granaries filled. And then the flood came again, and the wheel of the year turned once more. There was a deep comfort in that certainty, a sense that the world could be trusted, that after every season of waiting, abundance would surely come. And so the farmers worked the good black soil. Here is one lifting water from a channel with a shaduf, a long wooden pole with a weight on one end and a bucket on the other, swinging it up and over with an easy, practiced motion. Nearby, oxen lean into a wooden plow, turning the earth, and fields of green wheat and blue-flowered flax ripple in the breeze. It was a gentle country to farm. There was sun almost every day, water when it was needed, and rich land that gave back grain and fruit and linen in abundance. The people who lived here were, for the most part, well-fed and content, and they believed, quite simply, that the gods had given them the finest place on earth. Along the river stood countless small villages, clusters of neat houses built of mud brick, with flat roofs where families slept on hot nights and shaded courtyards where they cooked and worked. Women carried tall water jars balanced on their shoulders. Grain lay drying in the sun. A donkey dozed in the shade. Life in these villages changed very little from one century to the next. A farmer in one age would have understood perfectly the life of his great-great-grandfather and of his great-great-grandson. There was a deep steadiness to it, a sense that the world was in its proper order and would remain so. On the river itself, fishermen went out in slender boats made from bundles of papyrus reeds tied together, light enough to lift with one hand. They cast their nets into the shining water and drew them up heavy with fish, while herons and wild ducks rose from the reed beds around them. The Nile was full of life. It fed the people not only with its flood but with its fish and its birds and its water, and the Egyptians loved it as one loves a parent. They even sang hymns to the river, praising it as a living thing that fed the whole of the land. Where the river met the desert, there were great marshes of papyrus, tall green reeds crowded with blue lotus flowers and clouds of birds. These marshes were the Egyptians' hunting grounds and their playgrounds. A nobleman might glide through them in a light boat with his family, throwing curved sticks at the ducks that burst up from the reeds, while fish slipped through the clear water below. In the tomb paintings, these marsh scenes appear again and again, full of joy and color, for the Egyptians hoped to enjoy such pleasures forever, even in the life beyond death. And where people gather, there is always trade. On the riverbanks, busy harbors and markets grew up, crowded with wooden boats unloading their cargoes. Grain and pottery, linen and baskets, stone and timber and precious things from far-off lands, all moved up and down the Nile, for the river was Egypt's great highway. Merchants haggled, porters bent under heavy loads, and the water was crowded with sails. There were no coins in early Egypt. People traded goods for goods, a measure of grain for a jar of oil, a length of linen for a fine pot, and everything was weighed and recorded with great care. That care was the work of the scribes, and much of it happened here, among the granaries. These great mud-brick storehouses held the grain that was the true wealth of Egypt, gathered from the fields at each harvest. Scribes stood counting and tallying every basket, writing the amounts on scrolls, for the grain belonged in large part to the pharaoh and the temples, and not a single measure could go unaccounted. In good years the granaries were filled to bursting, and that stored grain was Egypt's safety, the food that would keep the people alive if ever the flood should fail and the harvest come up short. Inside the simple homes of the people, the work of daily life went on much as it had always done. Here, women kneel grinding grain between two stones, turning it to flour. Others shape flat loaves of bread and bake them in a clay oven, or brew beer in tall jars, straining it thick and nourishing. Bread and beer, these were the foundation of every Egyptian meal, for rich and poor alike. Workers were even paid in them. The whole mighty kingdom, in the end, ran on bread and beer and the muscles of ordinary people, and it is those ordinary people, more than any king, whom I would like you to remember tonight. But it is the works of the kings that still take our breath away. Look now upon the greatest of them, rising from the desert at Giza. Here are the pyramids being built, and the scale of it is almost beyond believing. Thousands upon thousands of workers haul enormous blocks of limestone, each one heavier than a family of oxen, up long ramps of packed earth, dragging them on wooden sledges over sand kept wet to help them slide. There are no machines here, no iron tools, no wheels for these great weights. There are only ropes and levers, and the patient, organized labor of a whole people, working season after season under the burning sun. It took perhaps 20 years to raise a single great pyramid, 20 years of ceaseless effort by a workforce that may have numbered in the tens of thousands, and it is thought that a great block was set in place every few minutes, all day, every day, for 2 decades. Stand and watch it for a moment in your mind. The endless lines of workers on the ramps, the creak of the ropes, the calls of the overseers, the dust hanging golden in the air, the impossible shape rising, course by course, ever higher toward the sky. It is one of the greatest feats of human cooperation the world has ever seen, and it was done at the very dawn of civilization, by a people who did it, above all, out of faith. And who were these workers? For a long time, people imagined them as slaves driven with whips. But the truth, as far as we can tell, is kinder and more remarkable. Beside the pyramids stood a whole town built for the builders, with rows of houses, and bakeries and breweries turning out bread and beer by the ton to feed them. The workers were mostly free Egyptians, farmers who came to labor on the King's Monument during the months when the fields were flooded and there was no farming to be done. They were fed, housed, and cared for, and when one of them was injured, we can see from their bones that they were nursed and healed. They built the pyramid together as one people, and there was pride in it. And what they built has never been equaled. When the Great Pyramid was finished, it did not look as it does today. It was covered in an outer casing of polished white limestone, smooth and gleaming, so that the whole vast structure shone in the sun like a mountain of light, its capstone perhaps sheathed in gold. It was the tallest building made by human hands, and it would remain so for nearly 4,000 years. Stand at its foot in your mind and look up and up and up at that dazzling white slope rising into the blue, and you begin to feel what the Egyptians felt, that their king was something more than a man and that his monument would outlast time itself. Near the pyramids crouched their eternal guardian, the great Sphinx, carved from a single ridge of living rock into the body of a lion and the face of a king. In its own age, it did not stand weathered and bare as it does now. Its face was painted, its headdress striped in bright colors, and offerings were laid before it. It gazed out across the desert toward the rising sun, patient and unblinking, and it has gone on gazing, through every age since, watching empires rise and crumble while it kept its silent watch over the tombs of the kings. There is a lovely old story carved on a slab of stone that still stands between its great paws. Long ago, they say, when the Sphinx was already ancient and half buried in the drifting desert sand, a young prince was out hunting and grew tired in the heat of the day and lay down to rest in the shade of the Sphinx's great head, the only part still rising above the sand. And as he slept, he dreamed, and in his dream the Sphinx itself spoke to him and told him that if he would only clear away the sand that smothered it, it would make him king of all Egypt. The prince awoke and did as the dream had asked, and freed the great statue from the sand. And in time, the story says, he did indeed become pharaoh, just as the Sphinx had promised him in his sleep. It is one of the oldest recorded dreams in all of human history, a dream of a sleeping prince in the shadow of that great and patient face, more than 3,000 years ago. See them now as travelers have always seen them at the close of day. The pyramids of Giza at sunset, three great shapes standing dark against a sky of burning orange and deep violet, their long shadows stretching across the golden sand. In the distance, a line of camels crosses the dunes. There is a stillness here that settles the heart. These monuments were already ancient when Rome was young, already old beyond memory when Cleopatra looked upon them. They have watched more sunsets than any living thing, and something of their deep calm seems to reach across the ages to us, even now, as the light fades and the desert cools toward night. Beyond the tombs of the kings rose the houses of the gods. Step now into the vast hall of a great Egyptian temple, and feel how small you become. All around you stand enormous columns of carved and painted stone, so many and so huge that they form a forest, their tops opening like giant lotus flowers and papyrus stems far overhead. Shafts of sunlight fall between them from high windows, catching the drifting dust, while the rest lies in cool shadow. Every surface is covered with color and with the sacred writing. In such a place, a person could only fall silent and feel the nearness of things far greater than themselves. The entrance to such a temple was a mighty gateway called a pylon, two great sloping towers of stone rising on either side of the doorway, carved with giant figures of the gods and of the pharaoh triumphant. Before them stood tall flagpoles hung with colored banners that snapped in the wind, and pairs of obelisks, single slender needles of red granite tipped with gold, catching the first and last light of the sun. To pass between them was to leave the ordinary world behind and enter the dwelling place of a god. Leading up to some temples ran long avenues lined on both sides with rows of stone sphinxes, sometimes with the heads of rams, sacred to the god Ammonius. They stretched away into the distance, statue after statue after statue, guarding the sacred road along which the great processions passed. Walking between them, priests and pilgrims moved toward the temple gates in solemn lines, and the whole approach was designed to fill the heart with awe long before one ever reached the God within. As evening came, the temples grew even more beautiful. The painted columns and carved walls glowed in the light of torches and the last red rays of the sun, and incense smoke drifted through the courts. priests moved quietly through the shadows, tending the sacred fires and singing the evening hymns. The temple was never truly still. Day and night, in every age, there were those who served the gods within it, keeping the ancient rites, so that the order of the world might be maintained and the sun be helped to rise once more. Deep inside, past hall after hall, each darker and more sacred than the last, lay the innermost sanctuary. Here stood a golden shrine, and within it the statue of the god. Only the highest priests and the pharaoh himself might enter this holy place. Each day the priests would open the shrine, wash and dress and feed the divine statue as one would care for a living being, and burn incense before it, before closing it away again in darkness. The people never saw these rites. They knew only that in the heart of the temple, the god was being served, and that as long as the service continued, all would be well. Yet, on the great festival days, the god came out to meet the people. The priests would lift a golden sacred boat onto their shoulders, and within it, hidden in a shrine, rode the statue of the god, carried out of the temple and through the streets in a magnificent procession. Crowds lined the way, throwing flowers, singing and clapping, musicians playing, the whole city given over to joy. For a few days the ordinary rules of life were set aside. There was feasting and freedom and celebration, and the distant, hidden god came near to the people who loved him. The priests who served the gods were a class apart. They shaved their heads and their whole bodies, bathed many times a day, and dressed only in the purest white linen, for cleanliness was holiness. Here you see them at their most solemn work, pouring libations of water and wine upon an altar, burning fragrant incense, laying out offerings of food and flowers before the temple. Every gesture was fixed by ancient custom, every word of the ritual precisely as it had always been spoken. The Egyptians believed that these rites, performed correctly, held the very universe in its place. But of all the concerns of the Egyptians, none was greater than death and what lay beyond it. For they did not believe that death was the end. They believed that a person could live again, forever in a world beyond, if only the body were preserved and the proper rites performed. And so they perfected, over many centuries, the sacred art of embalming. Here, a priest wearing the black jackal mask of Anubis, the god of the dead, leans with great care over a body laid upon a lion-shaped table. It is patient, reverent, holy work. The body is cleansed and dried and wrapped in fine linen, so that it might endure and the soul might have a home to return to. And what did they believe awaited the soul? That after death, the heart of the dead would be weighed. In the great hall of judgment, the jackal god Anubis would place the heart upon one pan of a golden scale, and upon the other, a single feather, the feather of truth and justice. If the heart was light, unburdened by cruelty and lies, it balanced against the feather, and the soul passed on into paradise. If it was heavy with wrongdoing, it was devoured, and the soul was lost forever. The ibis-headed god Thoth stood by, recording the verdict. It is one of the oldest and most beautiful visions of conscience the world has ever made, that in the end, each of us is weighed by the truth of our own heart. To sustain the dead and to honor the gods, the Egyptians brought offerings, heaps of good things laid upon the temple tables. Bread and roasted fowl, grapes and figs, jars of wine and beer, and everywhere the blue lotus flower, whose sweet scent was sacred. These offerings fed the gods and fed the spirits of the dead, and reminded everyone that the bounty of the living was owed, in the end, to the powers of heaven. Behind the tables rose walls covered in painted hieroglyphs, prayers and spells and the names of the gods, glowing softly in the warm light. Above all of this, above priests and people and even the gods' own servants, stood one figure, the pharaoh. See him now enthroned in his hall, wearing the double crown that joined the two lands of Upper and Lower Egypt into one. The crook and the flail crossed upon his chest, gold and deep blue lapis at his throat. The pharaoh was not, to the Egyptians, merely a king. He was the living link between the people and the gods, a god himself in human form, the one whose right rule kept the sun rising, the river flooding, and chaos held forever at bay. When he was strong, Egypt was strong. When the throne was weak, the whole world seemed to tremble. In war, the pharaoh rode at the head of his armies in a chariot of gold, drawn by two plumed horses, his bow drawn, the image of power itself. Egypt was, for long ages, protected by its deserts and its seas, and knew peace within its borders. But when enemies threatened or when the pharaohs reached out to build an empire, they marched south into Nubia and east into Asia, and the tomb walls show us the king, larger than any other figure, triumphant over his foes. Whether these victories were as complete as the carvings claim, we cannot always say. But the image was what mattered, the pharaoh as the unconquerable defender of the land. In peace, the pharaoh traveled his kingdom upon the river, in a royal barge of gilded wood, its great sail spread, its decks bright with banners and lotus flowers. To see the king's ship pass upon the Nile was, for the common people, to see a piece of heaven float by. The whole of Egypt was, in a sense, gathered around that river, and the pharaoh moving along it, from temple to temple and city to city, bound the long thin land together into one. Golden light on golden water, and the god-king passing, unhurried, through his kingdom. Nor was the court only a place of men. The royal women of Egypt held real honor and, at times, real power. A great queen, in her pleated linen gown and elaborate wig, her broad golden collar heavy with jewels, might stand beside the pharaoh as his equal in the eyes of the people, mother of the heirs, mistress of a great household, sometimes the power behind the throne, and once or twice, as we shall see, the holder of the throne itself. The luxury of the palace was extraordinary: perfumes and fine linen, ebony and ivory, gold and gems, all the wealth of a rich kingdom gathered into a few shining rooms. And recording all of it always was the scribe. Here sits one at his work, cross-legged, a papyrus scroll unrolled across his lap, a fine reed brush in his hand, his palette of black and red ink beside him. The scribes were the memory and the machinery of Egypt. They counted the harvest and the cattle, wrote the letters and the laws, kept the temple records and the royal histories, and copied out the sacred texts. To be a scribe was to escape the hard labor of the fields, to rise in the world, perhaps even to stand near the king. A father urging his son to study wrote that the scribe alone is his own master, and that of all trades, there is none its equal. And so the scribe, sitting quietly with his brush and his scroll, was in his own way as important to Egypt as any general or priest, for it was the scribes who held the whole vast kingdom together, who remembered what had been and recorded what was, and who, without ever lifting a stone, made certain that nothing of Egypt would ever be truly forgotten. It is thanks to them and to the words they wrote and carved so patiently that we can sit here tonight, thousands of years later, and know their world at all. The scribes were made, not born, and here is where they were made, the scribal school. Rows of boys sit cross-legged before a master, practicing the sacred signs over and over on smooth boards and broken shards of pottery, for papyrus was too precious to waste on lessons. It was hard and patient work, learning the hundreds of signs and the fine art of the brush, and the masters were strict. But the reward was a life of comfort and honor, and so the boys bent to their studies, copying out the old wise sayings again and again, some of which survive to this day in the very copies their small hands made. Egypt was a land of superb craftsmen, and their skill still astonishes us. Here in a workshop, goldsmiths and jewelers bend over their delicate work, shaping collars and rings and amulets, setting them with gleaming stones and bright blue faience. The treasures they made, the golden masks and inlaid jewelry and finely wrought ornaments, are among the most beautiful objects human hands have ever produced, and when we look upon them now, across so many thousands of years, we feel at once the presence of a real person, an artist, patient and gifted, who sat and made this lovely thing. All around, the other crafts go on. Potters shape wet clay upon their wheels. Weavers work the fine linen thread upon their looms. Carpenters saw and join precious wood into furniture and coffins. Sculptors patiently free a figure from a block of stone. These were the skilled hands that built and furnished a civilization, working with simple tools and endless patience, passing their craft from father to son across the generations. Much of what they made was meant to last forever, and a great deal of it has. For the fortunate, life in Egypt could be very sweet indeed. Here is the garden of a wealthy man's villa, a cool green paradise walled away from the heat and dust. There is a rectangular pool at its center, bright with lotus flowers and fish, shaded by date palms and fig trees and sweet-smelling flowers. The family rests here in the cool of the day, in fine white linen, at ease in the shade. To the Egyptians, such a garden was a little piece of paradise itself, and they hoped to enjoy just such gardens forever in the life beyond. And they knew how to hold a feast. See this banquet, the guests in their finest pleated linen, cones of scented perfumed fat upon their wigs to melt sweetly through the evening, seated at low tables heaped with roast fowl and fruit and bread, while servants move among them pouring wine. There are flowers everywhere, and above all the blue lotus, whose fragrance filled the air. It was an evening of music and laughter and plenty, and the tomb paintings show us these feasts again and again, for the Egyptians meant to go on enjoying them in good company through all eternity. At the heart of the feast were the musicians and the dancers. A woman plays a tall, graceful harp. Others sound lutes and flutes and clap the rhythm. Slender dancers move through the lamplight in flowing linen. Music filled Egyptian life, in the temple and the palace and the humble home alike, at festivals and funerals and feasts. We cannot hear their songs now, for the melodies are lost forever, but we can see the players in the paintings, their fingers on the strings, and almost catch the echo of a music that once filled these warm and golden rooms. And here, tender and quiet, is the heart of it all, an ordinary family, at home together in the warm light. Parents rest in a sunlit courtyard while the children play nearby with simple wooden toys, and a cat dozes, and ducks waddle by. For all the temples and tombs and mighty kings, this was what life was truly about for the Egyptians, as it is for us. The love of a family, the safety of home, the small, ordinary happiness of being together. They cherished it deeply and hoped, more than anything, to keep it forever. The Egyptians were famous throughout the ancient world for their physicians, and here one tends a patient with quiet care, examining, applying remedies and bandages, his medicines and his scrolls of learning close at hand. Their doctors knew a great deal, how to set bones and dress wounds and treat a host of ailments with remedies drawn from the plants and minerals around them. Alongside their medicine ran prayer and magic, spells and protective amulets, for healing was a sacred art as much as a practical one. Sick people came from distant lands to be treated by the healers of Egypt. Out in the streets, the marketplace hums with life. People barter for what they need, grain and linen and fish, pottery and jewelry, ducks and goats, for there was no money as we know it, and everything was traded good for good. A scribe stands by with his balance, weighing out metal or grain to settle the value of a bargain. It is a scene of color and chatter and haggling, of neighbors meeting and news exchanged, the ordinary busy heart of a town, little different in its way from a market anywhere in any age. And here is where the daily bread was made, the bakery and the brewery, the twin foundations of every Egyptian meal. Workers shape and stack the loaves and tend the ovens, while nearby the beer ferments in tall jars, thick and mildly strong and deeply nourishing. Bread and beer were food and drink and even wages, the very stuff of life for rich and poor alike. The warm smell of baking bread must have drifted through every street in Egypt, morning after morning, for thousands of years, one of the small constant comforts of that ancient world. But now the land begins to change and grow solemn as we come to the place of the king's rest. Here is the Valley of the Kings, a stark and silent valley of golden cliffs deep in the western desert, where, for centuries, the pharaohs of the empire were buried, no longer under towering pyramids that only invited robbers, but in tombs cut secretly and deep into the living rock. guards watched the lonely paths. The burning sun beat down on the empty stone. And beneath the silence, hidden in the dark, lay the greatest treasures of the age. Deep within those tombs, by the light of oil lamps, the painters worked their quiet magic. Here they cover the walls of a burial chamber with vivid images, gods and hieroglyphs and scenes of the journey through the afterlife, in brilliant blues and golds and reds that would never fade, sealed away in the dark. No one was meant ever to see this beauty again once the tomb was closed. It was made for the dead and for the gods. And yet, 3,000 years later, when the tombs were opened once more, the colors were found still glowing, as fresh as the day the painter laid down his brush. And this was what such labor prepared: the treasure of a pharaoh's tomb, a chamber heaped with gold. A gleaming golden mask, gilded shrines and coffins, chariots and thrones and statues, chests of jewelry, jars of oil and wine, everything a king might need in eternity, glowing softly in the lamplight. Into the tomb went a whole life's comforts, and little servant figures believed to come alive and labor for the king in the beyond, so that he might rest. It was not treasure hoarded out of greed, but a life packed carefully away for the longest of all journeys. See now the funeral itself, the solemn procession crossing to the west, the land of the setting sun and of the dead. Priests and mourners in white move in a long line. Oxen draw the sledge that bears the great gilded coffin, and the women raise their arms and voices in ritual grief. It was a slow and sacred journey, from the world of the living on the east bank of the river to the tombs in the western desert, mirroring the daily journey of the sun itself, which was born in the east each morning and died in the west each night, to be reborn again at dawn. And so the king is laid to rest. Here in the burial chamber his golden coffin is set in place, the mummy within wrapped and masked in gold, surrounded by the canopic jars and the treasures and the painted walls, while the priests perform the final sacred rites by lamplight. Then the chamber would be sealed, and the passage filled, and the entrance hidden, and the king left alone in the silence and the dark, to begin, as his people believed, not an ending, but a long sleep and a waking into a life that would never end. Now the ages turn, and we come at last to a new and dazzling city by the sea. This is Alexandria, in the final chapter of Egypt's long story, its great harbor crowned by the towering white lighthouse, one of the wonders of the world, its fire guiding ships in from far across the water. Here Greek and Egyptian met and mingled in a brilliant, bustling, cosmopolitan city, the most splendid of its age, full of palaces and colonnades and ships from every corner of the known world. For all its glory, though, Alexandria stood at the end of the tale, in the last twilight of the pharaohs. And here was Alexandria's truest wonder, the great library, which set out to gather every book in all the world. Endless shelves of papyrus scrolls, hundreds of thousands of them, fill its halls, and among them the finest scholars of the age read and argue and think, mapping the stars, measuring the earth, laying down the foundations of learning for every century to come. It was the brightest lamp of knowledge the ancient world ever lit. Much of it would one day be lost, but the light it kindled was passed on, and never wholly went out. And here, at the very last, is she, Cleopatra, the final pharaoh of Egypt, upon her royal barge on the Nile at golden dusk. She sits regal and beautiful in her fine linen and Egyptian jewels, amid incense and music, the last of a line that stretched back 3,000 years. She was clever and learned and full of charm and courage, and she loved the ancient kingdom she had been born to rule. But she came to her throne in the shadow of a mightier power across the sea, and her whole reign would be a brilliant, desperate struggle to keep her ancient land free. For the true master of the world, by now, was Rome, and Egypt survived only so long as Rome allowed. Here the two worlds meet face to face. The Queen of Egypt in her marble hall, receiving a Roman general in his armor and red cloak, the old kingdom and the new empire, measuring one another. Cleopatra's weapons in this unequal struggle were her wit and her wealth and her alliances with the most powerful men of Rome. For a time, against all odds, she very nearly succeeded in holding back the tide. But the tide, in the end, was Rome, and it could not be held forever. And so we come to the end of the long, long story. Here, in the last red light of a setting sun, a lone Sphinx and the distant pyramids stand silent upon the sand, while far out on the sea, the sails of Roman ships appear upon the horizon. The age of the pharaohs, which had lasted 3,000 years, was coming to its close, and ancient Egypt would pass, at last, into the keeping of others, and then into memory, and then into legend. But its monuments would stand, and its river would flow, and its story would wait, sleeping in the sand, to be woken and wondered at by every age that followed, down to this very night. Watch that last light fade upon the ancient stones, and let us follow the whole story now, from its very beginning into the gathering dark. The picture before you will change now, and grow simple and dark, with only a soft drift of embers in the quiet. Close your eyes if they are not already closed. You need not watch anything more. Let my voice go on alone, and let the long, long story of Egypt unfold in the darkness behind your eyes, as you sink slowly down towards sleep. For we have wandered through the living land, and seen its river and its fields, its temples and its tombs, its kings and its people. Now let us go back to the very beginning and follow the whole vast river of Egyptian time, age by age, from its first faint source to the sea. In the beginning, before there was any Egypt at all, there were only scattered farming villages along the Nile, small communities of people who had learned, thousands of years ago, to plant the black soil and to herd their animals and to bury their dead with care. Slowly, over many centuries, these villages grew and joined together until there were two kingdoms upon the river. In the south lay Upper Egypt, the long narrow valley, whose kings wore a tall white crown. In the north lay Lower Egypt, the wide green fan of the Nile Delta where the river spread into many mouths before reaching the sea, whose kings wore a red crown. For a long time these two lands were separate and sometimes at war. And then, in an age so distant that its history had already faded into legend by the time the pyramids were built, a king of the south conquered the north and joined the two lands into one. The Egyptians remembered him as Menes or Narmer, the first pharaoh, and they never forgot what he had done. Forever after, the pharaoh wore the double crown, the white and the red together, and bore the title Lord of the Two Lands, in memory of that first uniting. It was around 5,000 years ago. It was one of the first times in all of human history that a great kingdom was forged, and it would endure in one form or another for 3,000 years. We can still see, carved on an ancient slab of dark stone from that very dawn of history, an image of that first king, wearing the tall white crown of the south, raising his mace to strike down an enemy of the north, and on the other side, wearing the red crown, walking in triumph, the two lands brought under one hand. It is one of the oldest historical documents in the world, a picture of the very moment a nation was born. And from that moment flows everything else, the whole long river of Egyptian time, 3,000 years of pharaohs, longer than the span from that first king to our own day was longer than almost any human institution has ever lasted. When you hear that the pyramids are old, remember this, that Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, lived nearer in time to us today than she did to the building of the Great Pyramid. Such was the depth of Egyptian time. It is almost too vast for the mind to hold, and there is a strange peace in that vastness, a sense of how gently the great river of the years bears everything along. The first centuries of that United Kingdom we call the Old Kingdom, and it was the great age of the pyramid builders. The kings of this age gathered such power and commanded such wealth and such devotion that they could raise the mightiest tombs the world had ever seen. It began with a king named Djoser and his brilliant architect, a man named Imhotep, whose name we still know more than 4,000 years later. Imhotep built for his king the first Great Pyramid, a step pyramid at Saqqara, 6 vast stone platforms rising one upon another, the first monumental building of cut stone anywhere on Earth. It still stands today. Before it, kings had been buried under low mounds of mud brick. After it, they reached for the sky. The reach reached its height with the kings of the following dynasty, and above all with the pharaoh Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid at Giza, the largest of them all. We have stood before it already in our mind's eye. 2 million and more great blocks of stone, raised into a shape so perfect and so precisely aligned to the stars and the 4 directions that it puzzles engineers even now. Beside it, his son and grandson raised 2 more, and the Sphinx to guard them. And then, having reached that impossible summit, the Pyramid Age slowly passed. Never again would Egypt pour so much of itself into tombs of such size. It was as if a young civilization had, in its first strength, flung itself as high as it could go, and then settled to the long work of simply living. And it was a well-run land, ordered and governed with a care that few kingdoms of the ancient world could match. Beneath the pharaoh stood a great official called the vizier, who managed the day-to-day running of the whole kingdom, the chief judge and treasurer and overseer of all, answering to the king alone. Beneath him spread a vast machinery of governors and officials and scribes, reaching into every province and every town, collecting the harvest, storing the grain, judging disputes, maintaining the canals, organizing the labor, recording everything. The land was divided into provinces, each with its own governor and its own local god and traditions, and yet all bound together under the one crown and the one great river. It was one of the first true states in the history of the world, a kingdom run not by force alone but by writing and record and law, by the patient work of thousands of officials keeping the whole vast enterprise in order. And when that machinery worked, Egypt flourished as few lands ever have, in peace and plenty year upon year upon year. For the old kingdom did not last forever. After many centuries of stable rule, the central power of the pharaohs weakened. The reasons are tangled and not fully known, but there are signs that a series of low floods brought famine, that the great nobles in the provinces grew too strong, and that the throne lost its grip. And so Egypt fell, for the first time, into a long period of division and confusion that later Egyptians remembered with horror, a time when there was no single strong king, when local lords fought one another, when, as one writer of the age lamented, the land turned upside down and the poor became rich and the rich became poor. We call it the First Intermediate Period. It was the first proof that even Egypt, that most stable of lands, could fall into chaos when the throne failed. But Egypt always rose again. After about a century and a half of division, a strong family of rulers from the southern city of Thebes fought their way to power, defeated their rivals, and united the two lands once more. So began the Middle Kingdom, remembered by later Egyptians as a golden age, a time of good and just kings who cared for their people, dug great canals, reclaimed marshland for farming, and pushed Egypt's power south into Nubia with its gold mines. It was also the great age of Egyptian literature. Many of the finest stories and poems and wise sayings that survive were written or first told in this age, tales of shipwrecked sailors and eloquent peasants and kings speaking to their sons, work still studied and loved thousands of years later. The most famous of them all was the story of a man named Sinew, an official who fled Egypt in fear after the death of his king, and made a whole new life for himself far away in the lands of the East, growing rich and honored among foreign people with a family of his own. And yet, as he grew old, he was seized by a longing so deep it could not be denied. The longing to come home, to see the Nile once more before he died, to be buried in the good soil of Egypt rather than in a foreign grave. And in the end, the pharaoh forgave him and called him home, and he returned to Egypt to live out his days and to be buried at last among his own people. It is a story of exile and homecoming, of the pull of the homeland upon the human heart, and the Egyptians loved it and copied it for 1,000 years, and it moves us still, for it speaks of something every human being understands, the longing for home. Yet the Middle Kingdom, too, in time grew weak, and Egypt slipped again into division. And this time something happened that had never happened before. Egypt was conquered from outside. Into the delta of the north came a people the Egyptians called the Hyksos, rulers from the lands of Asia to the east, who settled in Egypt in great numbers and at last seized power over the north, ruling it as foreign kings. To the proud Egyptians, who had always believed themselves the favored people of the gods, safe behind their deserts, this was a wound to the very soul. Foreigners sat upon the throne of the two lands. But the Hyksos also brought new things with them, the horse and the chariot, new weapons of bronze, new tools of war. And in the south, at Thebes, the old Egyptian royal line still held, and gathered its strength, and prepared to take everything back. It was the princes of Thebes who at last drove the Hyksos out, in a long and bitter war of liberation, and reunited Egypt once again. And out of that war of liberation was born the greatest age of all, the new kingdom, the age of empire. For the Egyptians had learned a hard lesson. They had learned that their deserts alone could not protect them, that danger could come from beyond their borders, and that it was better to march out and meet that danger far away than to wait for it to come to the Nile. And so the pharaohs of the new kingdom became warrior kings, and Egypt, for the first time, reached out to build an empire that stretched far beyond the river valley, south deep into Nubia and north across the lands of Canaan and Syria, all the way to the great river Euphrates. But before we follow the warrior kings, let us pause here in the dark and speak of the gods, for you cannot understand Egypt without them. The Egyptians lived in a world that was crowded with gods, thousands of them, great and small. There were gods of the sun and the moon and the sky, gods of the river and the harvest and the desert, gods of love and of war, of wisdom and of childbirth, of writing and of wine. Some had the heads of animals, a falcon, a jackal, a cow, an ibis, a cat, for the Egyptians saw the divine in the creatures around them. Some were worshipped across the whole land, and some only in a single town. And the stories told about them were among the most beautiful the ancient world ever made. Above all stood the sun. The Egyptians watched the sun rise each morning out of the eastern desert, cross the whole sky, and sink each evening into the west. And they made of that daily journey a great and comforting story. The sun god, whom they called Ra, sailed each day across the sky in a golden boat, from dawn to dusk. And each night, when he set in the west, he entered the dark underworld and sailed through it, through the 12 hours of the night, facing terrible dangers in the darkness, before rising again, reborn in the east at dawn. Every sunrise, then, was a victory. Every morning, the god had passed through death and come back into the light. And the Egyptians believed that their own prayers and rituals helped him make that passage, so that the sun would rise and the world would go on. And how did they believe the world itself had begun? They told it in a way that is strangely soothing to hear in the dark. In the very beginning, they said, there was nothing but a vast, dark, formless ocean, without shore or surface or light, an endless deep of still water in the blackness, and this they called none. There was no earth, no sky, no time, only that silent, sleeping sea, stretching on forever. And then, out of that dark water, by its own will, the first mound of dry land rose up, as the mounds of fertile earth rose each year out of the retreating flood. And upon that first hill the first god came into being, alone and by his own power. And it was he who brought forth all the rest, the god of air and the goddess of moisture, and from them the earth below and the sky above, and from them in turn the great gods of the Egyptian world. So light and order and life emerged, little by little, out of the dark still water, and the world was made. And the Egyptians believed that the dark ocean of Nun still surrounded the world on every side, held back beyond the edges of the sky, and that each night when the sun sank and darkness returned, the world touched again, for a while, that first sleeping deep from which all things had come. The most beloved of all their stories, though, was the tale of Osiris, and it is a story worth telling slowly tonight, for it is a story of death and love and life renewed. Long ago, they said, in the age before human kings, the god Osiris ruled Egypt as its first pharaoh, and he was a good and gentle king. He taught the people how to farm, how to grow grain and vines, how to live by just laws, and under him the land was happy. But Osiris had a brother named Set, a god of the desert and of storms and of chaos, and Set was jealous of his brother's throne, and hated him. And so Set plotted against Osiris. He built a beautiful chest, made exactly to the measure of his brother's body, and at a great feast he promised to give it to whoever fit inside it perfectly. One by one the guests climbed in, and none fit. And then Osiris, suspecting nothing, lay down inside, and he fit perfectly, for the chest had been made for him. And at once Set and his followers slammed the lid, and sealed it fast, and flung it into the Nile, and the river carried the trapped god away to his death. So the good king was murdered by his brother, and chaos came into the world. But Osiris had a wife, and her name was Isis, and she loved him beyond all telling. And Isis would not accept his death. She set out, grieving, to search the whole land for the body of her husband, wandering far and wide, until at last she found the chest, and brought it home, and hid it in the marshes. But cruel Set found it again, and in his rage he tore the body of Osiris into many pieces, and scattered them across the whole of Egypt, so that his brother could never be whole again. And once more the faithful Isis set out, this time to gather the scattered pieces of the one she loved, traveling the length of the land, finding them one by one, and wherever she found a piece, it was said, a holy shrine arose. And when she had gathered them, Isis, who was the greatest of all in magic, bound the body of Osiris together again in linen, the first mummy, and with her wings and her spells she breathed life back into him, just long enough. And from that brief return of life, Isis conceived a son. Then Osiris passed from the world of the living, but he did not simply die. He went down into the underworld, and there he became its king, the lord and judge of the dead, the god who welcomed every Egyptian soul into the life beyond, and promised them, as he himself had shown, that death need not be the end. This was the heart of Egyptian hope, that as Osiris had died and lived again, so might they. And the child of Isis and the dead Osiris was the god Horus, the falcon, and Isis hid him and raised him in secret in the marshes, guarding him from his uncle Set, who would have killed him too. And when Horus was grown, he went to war against Set to avenge his father and win back his rightful throne. Their struggle was long and terrible, and it went on, in the stories, for 80 years, until at last the gods gave their judgment, and Horus was granted the throne of Egypt, and Set was cast out into the desert. And from that day, the Egyptians said, every living pharaoh was Horus upon his throne, and every pharaoh who died became Osiris in the world beyond. In the loving Isis, the Egyptians found a mother goddess of endless faithfulness, who would be worshipped for thousands of years, far beyond the borders of Egypt itself. It is one of the oldest stories in the world of love that is stronger than death, and it lay at the very center of everything the Egyptians believed. There were so many other gods. There was Ammonius, the hidden one, the great god of Thebes, who rose with the new kingdom to become the king of the gods, worshipped in the vast temple of Karnak. There was Hathor, the gentle cow goddess of love and music and joy, who welcomed the dead in the west. There was Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing and the moon, the keeper of all knowledge, who invented the sacred script and recorded the judgment of souls. There was Anubis, the jackal, the guardian of the dead and the master of embalming, who watched over the tombs. There was Bes, a cheerful, ugly little dwarf god who protected homes and mothers and sleeping children, and Taaret, a goddess in the shape of a standing hippopotamus, who guarded women in childbirth. The Egyptians did not fear their gods so much as live among them, as a family lives together, and every act of daily life, from planting to healing to sleeping, was watched over by some kindly power. And above and behind all the gods there stood a single great idea, perhaps the deepest idea in all of Egyptian thought, which they called Ma'at. Ma'at was truth and justice and balance and right order all at once, the way the world was meant to be. It was Ma'at that the sun rose each morning, that the river flooded each year, that the strong protected the weak and the judge gave a fair verdict and children honored their parents and the seasons followed one another in their proper turn. Ma'at was pictured as a goddess, a woman with a single feather upon her head, that same feather of truth against which the heart of every soul was weighed after death. And the whole duty of the pharaoh, his one great task above all others, was to uphold Ma'at, to keep the right order of the world against the ever-pressing forces of chaos and disorder and lies. When the king ruled justly and the rites were performed and the land was at peace, Ma'at prevailed and all was well. It was a beautiful and a hopeful vision, that beneath all the changing surface of things there is a deep and rightful order, a balance that can be kept, a truth by which all hearts are measured, and that the great task of a life and of a kingdom is simply to live in harmony with it. And they saw the divine especially in animals. Cats were sacred, beloved, and honored, and to harm one was a dreadful crime, for the cat was linked to the goddess Batet, protector of the home. The great Nile crocodile was worshipped as the god Sobek. The ibis and the baboon were sacred to Thoth, the falcon to Horus, the jackal to Anubis, the scarab beetle to the rising sun. For the Egyptians watched the little beetle roll its ball of dung across the sand and saw in it an image of the god who rolled the sun across the sky. In the temples, sacred animals were kept and cared for, and when they died they too were mummified with reverence, and buried in vast animal cemeteries, millions of them, cats and birds and crocodiles, each one a small offering to a god. Let us return, for a moment, to those great monuments, the pyramids, for they are the wonder that has never ceased to puzzle and amaze the world. How were they built? It is a question people have asked for thousands of years, and the truth is that we still do not know every answer. consider the Great Pyramid of Khufu alone. It is made of more than 2 million blocks of stone. Each block weighs, on the average, more than 2 tons, and some of the great stones within it weigh many times that. They were quarried and shaped and moved and lifted into place one after another until the structure rose nearly 500 feet into the sky, and for almost 4,000 years it remained the tallest thing that human beings had ever built. And it was done without iron tools, without pulleys, without wheels for such weights, without any of the machines we would think necessary. It was done with copper tools and stone and rope and ramps and the organized muscle of tens of thousands of people. And it was done with astonishing precision. The 4 sides of the Great Pyramid are aligned almost perfectly to the 4 points of the compass, north and south and east and west, with an accuracy that we would find difficult to match even now, and that the builders achieved by watching the stars. Its base is level across its whole enormous width to within the breadth of a finger. Its sides rise at exactly the same angle, meeting in a single point far above. How they managed such perfection with the tools they had remains one of the great mysteries. Scholars still argue over the ramps, whether they were straight or spiraling, built up along the sides as the pyramid grew. But however it was done, it stands as a monument not only to a king, but to the patience and skill and sheer determination of a whole people, working together toward a single vast purpose across the span of many years. And why did they do it? Because to the Egyptians, the pyramid was far more than a tomb. Its very shape, they believed, was sacred, an image of the first mound of earth that had risen out of the waters of chaos at the creation of the world, and a stairway or a ramp of sunlight by which the dead king might climb to the heavens and join the eternal stars, or sail with the sun god in his golden boat. The pyramid was a machine for eternity, built to carry the god-king safely into the life beyond, and to stand forever as a sign of the unshakable order of the world. That they still stand, 4,500 years later, while the names of countless other kingdoms have blown away like dust, is perhaps the greatest proof that could be asked of Egyptian faith. The wealth that made such wonders possible came, in large part, from gold, for Egypt was rich in gold beyond any other land of the ancient world. In the eastern deserts and in Nubia to the south lay mines where gold was dug and washed from the rock, and it flowed into the treasuries of the pharaohs in such quantity that foreign kings wrote to Egypt begging for it, saying that in the land of the pharaoh, gold was as common as the dust of the road. That gold gilded the temples and the coffins and the great statues, and it bought the loyalty of allies and the service of soldiers. It was one of the deep sources of Egypt's power, and one of the reasons the pharaohs reached out to conquer Nubia, that golden land upon their southern border. And they were great traders, sending their ships and their caravans far beyond their borders in search of the things Egypt lacked. They sailed up the Nile into Nubia for gold and ivory and ebony and the skins of leopards and the feathers of ostriches, and for soldiers and servants. They sent expeditions across the eastern desert to the shores of the Red Sea, and from there by ship to a far and mysterious southern land they called Punt, the land of the gods, which we think lay somewhere along the coast of Africa, and from Punt they brought back gold and rare woods, and above all incense, the fragrant resins of myrrh and frankincense that were burned in every temple in the land, and even living trees, carried home in baskets to be planted in Egypt. They traded north and east as well, into the lands of Canaan and Syria and to the great island of Crete, exchanging their grain and their gold and their fine linen for cedar wood from the mountains of Lebanon, for silver, for copper and tin, for lapis lazuli, that deep and precious blue stone that came all the way from the distant mountains of the Far East. Egypt sat at the crossroads of the ancient world, and the wealth of many lands flowed through it. This age of empire, the new kingdom, is the Egypt that most of us picture when we dream of pharaohs, the Egypt of golden treasures and mighty temples and famous names, and its story is worth telling slowly, here in the dark. Let me tell you of some of the great ones who ruled in this age. There was a queen named Hatshepsut, one of the most remarkable rulers Egypt ever knew. She came to power as regent for a young stepson, and then did something almost unheard of. She took the full title and power of pharaoh for herself, and ruled Egypt in her own right for more than 20 years. And she ruled it well. Hers was an age not of war but of peace and of trade and of building. She sent a famous expedition far to the south, to the mysterious land of Punt, which returned laden with gold and ebony and incense and living myrrh trees. And she built, against a wall of golden cliffs, one of the most beautiful temples in all of Egypt, rising in great terraces from the desert floor. She had herself shown in the images wearing the false beard and the regalia of a king, for there was no word, no form, for a woman who was pharaoh. She simply made herself one. And yet, after her death, someone, perhaps that same stepson she had ruled in place of, tried to erase her from history, chiseling her name and her image from her monuments, as though a woman who had dared to be king must be unmade. For a long time she was almost forgotten, her very existence a puzzle to scholars who found her name scratched out wherever it had once been. But stone remembers what men try to forget, and patient study has brought her back to us, and today she is honored again as one of the greatest and most successful rulers Egypt ever had. A woman who took a throne that custom said was not hers, and held it and used it well and gave her people a golden age of peace. After her came her stepson, Thutmose III, and he was a very different ruler, a soldier of genius whom later ages have called the Napoleon of Egypt. Year after year he marched his armies into Asia and won battle after battle until Egypt's power reached its widest extent, and the wealth of 100 conquered cities flowed back to the temples of Thebes. Under kings like him, Egypt became the richest and most powerful land in the world, and the treasure of empire built the great temple of Karnak into the vast forest of columns whose hall we walked through earlier tonight, added to by pharaoh after pharaoh across the centuries. It was in this age of empire that Egypt built its great professional army, and for the first time the life of a soldier became a career a man might follow, and even rise by. They marched out in their thousands, ranks of spearmen and archers with their great bows, and above all the chariots, light and fast, each carrying a driver and a warrior with his bow, the pride and the striking power of the Egyptian host. A soldier's life was hard, and the scribes, who thought little of it, loved to describe its miseries, the long marches under the burning sun, the hunger and thirst, the wounds, the years far from home, all to persuade their pupils that the pen was better than the spear. But for many an ordinary Egyptian, the army was a path to reward, to a share of the plunder, to a grant of land, to honor in the eyes of the king. And along the far borders of the empire, in great fortresses of mud brick, Egyptian soldiers stood watch year after year, guarding the roads and the river against the enemies of the two lands, so that the farmers behind them could plant and harvest in peace, and the long, calm life of the valley could go on undisturbed. Then came one of the strangest episodes in all of Egyptian history. A pharaoh arose named Amenhotep IV, and he did something no Egyptian king had ever done. He turned against the ancient gods. All of them, the whole vast family of gods that Egypt had worshipped for thousands of years, he cast aside and declared that there was only one God worthy of worship, the Aten, the disk of the sun itself. He changed his own name to Akhenaten, servant of the Aten. He closed the old temples and struck the names of the old gods from the walls, and built an entirely new capital city in the empty desert, dedicated to his single god. And in the art of his reign, something tender and strange appears. The royal family shone not as stiff gods but as living people, the king and his beautiful queen Nefertiti holding their small daughters, the sun's rays reaching down to touch them with little hands. It was, some say, the first time in history that anyone worshipped a single god above all others. And beside him through it all stood his queen Nefertiti, whose name means the beautiful one has come, and whose face we still know, for a painted statue of her head survives, and it shows a woman of such serene and perfect beauty that she has become, across the whole world, one of the most famous faces of the ancient past. She seems to have shared in her husband's strange new faith, and perhaps in his power too, appearing beside him again and again in the tender, sunlit art of that brief and dreamlike age. But it did not last. It was too strange, too sudden, and it set the whole weight of the priesthood and the people against it. The old gods had been worshipped for 2,000 years and more. Their festivals were the joy of the people's year. Their priests were rich and powerful, and one man, however mighty, could not simply command a whole nation to forget the faith of its ancestors. The dream of the one God lived and died with the strange king who dreamed it. For when Akhenaten died, everything he had built was swept away. The old gods came roaring back, the old temples reopened, the new city in the desert was abandoned to the sand, and his very name was struck from the lists of kings, as if the Egyptians wished to forget that he had ever lived. And the boy who came to the throne soon after, a young son of that broken age, was made to abandon the new God and restore the old ways, and to change his own name in the doing. He had been called Tutankhamun. Now he became Tutankhamun. He was a child of perhaps 8 or 9 years old when he became pharaoh, and so of course it was others, his officials and advisors, who truly ruled in his name, guiding the boy king as they restored the old gods and the old ways his father had cast down. He grew into a young man, married a young queen, and then, while still very young, perhaps only 18 or 19 years old, he died. We do not know for certain how. His mummy shows that he was frail, that he had a clubbed foot and walked with the aid of canes, of which many were found in his tomb, and that he suffered from illness. Some have wondered whether he died of injury or disease, and darker minds have whispered of murder, but the truth is simply lost. He died young and childless. His line ended with him, and his advisors buried him hastily in a small tomb that had not been meant for a king. He did little that the histories of his own time thought worth recording, and within a few generations he too was very nearly forgotten, his name left off the official lists of kings. And that forgetting, as we shall see, was the strangest blessing that ever befell a pharaoh. And yet, of all the pharaohs of Egypt, it is that forgotten boy king whose name is today the most famous in all the world. For a strange reason. Because he was minor and half forgotten, his small tomb in the Valley of the Kings was overlooked and covered over, and escaped the robbers who emptied almost every other royal tomb across the centuries. And so, more than 3,000 years later, it would be found still full, still sealed, still packed with the dazzling golden treasure we glimpsed earlier tonight, the only royal tomb of Egypt ever found nearly whole. But that discovery lies far ahead in our story. For now, the boy king slept undisturbed in the dark, while the great river of Egyptian time flowed on. The last of the truly great pharaohs came a little afterward, and his name was Ramesses II, whom later ages called Ramesses the Great. He ruled for an extraordinary 66 years, so long that many of his subjects lived their whole lives never knowing another king. He fathered a great host of children. He built more monuments than any pharaoh before or since, temples and statues and whole cities. His name carved so deeply and so often into the stone of Egypt that it can never be erased. At a place called Abu Simbel, far in the south, he cut a temple into a cliff and set before it 4 colossal seated statues of himself, each as tall as a house, gazing out across the land. And early in his reign he fought a mighty battle against the empire of the Hittites, at a place called Kadesh, one of the greatest chariot battles of the ancient world, which he came close to losing but proclaimed ever after as a magnificent victory, carving the tale across the walls of temple after temple. That war ended, in time, in something remarkable. The world's first great peace treaty whose text still survives, sworn between Egypt and the Hittites, promising peace and friendship and the return of fugitives between the two great powers. We have a copy from each side and they agree. 3,000 years ago, 2 empires grew weary of war and chose, instead, to make peace and wrote it down and kept it. After Ramesses the Great, there were still strong kings for a time. But the age of empire was passing. The great days of the new kingdom were slowly coming to their end. There came, in those late days of empire, a great and mysterious storm out of the sea. From somewhere across the Mediterranean, whole peoples on the move, driven from their own homes by troubles we still do not fully understand, came sweeping down upon the ancient kingdoms of the East, burning and conquering as they came. The histories call them simply the Sea Peoples. They toppled mighty empires that had stood for centuries. The whole ordered world of the age seemed to be collapsing at once. And they came at last to the borders of Egypt itself, by land and by sea, a flood of ships and wagons and warriors bent on making a new home in the rich valley of the Nile. It was one of the gravest dangers Egypt ever faced. And Egypt met it in a last great effort under a warrior pharaoh named Ramesses III, the last of the truly powerful kings. In mighty battles on land and, remarkably, in a great sea fight in the very mouths of the Nile, the Egyptians hurled back the invaders and saved their land, and Ramesses III carved the story of that desperate victory across the walls of his great temple, where it can still be read today. Egypt survived. But the effort had exhausted her. The empire beyond the borders was gone for good now, the treasury was drained, and in the reign of that same king we hear of something never recorded before in all of Egyptian history. The workers who built the royal tombs, unpaid and hungry, laid down their tools and refused to work, the first recorded strike by laborers anywhere in the world. The old order was breaking. After Ramesses III, the kings grew weak, the priests of Ammonius grew strong, the tombs of the earlier pharaohs were plundered even by the officials meant to guard them, and the new kingdom faded slowly into division and decline. But before we leave that great age behind, let us remember its temples, for they were among the wonders of the world, and many still stand. Think of Karnak, the vast temple of Ammonius at Thebes, which the pharaohs enlarged across 2,000 years, until it became the largest religious building ever raised by human hands. A whole city of pylons and courts and obelisks, and that immense hall of towering columns. Think of Luxor Temple nearby, joined to Karnak by that long avenue of sphinxes, glowing golden in the evening light. Think of Abu Simbel far to the south, cut bodily into a cliff of rock, its 4 giant seated statues of Ramesses the Great gazing out across the land, built so cunningly that twice each year the rising sun shines straight through the entrance and down the whole length of the temple to light the gods in the sanctuary deep within. And think of the great festivals that filled those temples with life. Once a year at Thebes came the wonderful festival of Opet, when the statue of the god Ammonius was carried from Karnak to Luxor in a magnificent procession by land and river, and the whole city poured out to celebrate, with music and dancing and feasting, and bread and beer given freely to the crowds, for days on end. There were festivals of the dead, when families crossed to the western bank to visit the tombs of their ancestors and share a meal with them among the graves, joyful gatherings rather than mournful ones. The temples were not silent museums but the beating heart of the people's year, marking the seasons, binding the living and the dead and the gods together in one great unending rhythm of celebration, as steady and as sure as the rising of the river. But let us step away for a while from the kings and their wars and think instead of how ordinary people lived along the river in those long ages. For that, in the end, is the truer story of Egypt, the story of millions of quiet lives lived beside the Nile. Their houses were built of mud brick, cool in the heat of the day, with small high windows to keep out the sun. The poor lived in a room or two, the rich in fine houses with many rooms, painted walls, and gardens with pools and shade trees. On hot nights, families climbed to the flat roofs to sleep under the stars, with the warm wind off the desert. There was little furniture, low stools and beds, chests for clothing and linen, mats upon the floor. Life was simple, but for most, in most years, it was enough. They ate well by the standards of the ancient world. Bread and beer were the foundation of every meal, But there was far more besides. Onions and garlic and leeks, beans and lentils and cucumbers, figs and dates and grapes and pomegranates. There was fish from the river and fowl from the marshes, and for the well-off, the meat of cattle and goats. Honey was their sweetness, for there was no sugar. They flavored their food with herbs and drank beer thick as soup, and the rich drank wine from their own vineyards. To sit down to bread still warm, an onion, a handful of dates, and a jar of beer in the shade beside the river was the plain contentment of Egyptian life, and it changed hardly at all across 3,000 years. Their clothing was simple and suited to the heat, made of linen woven from the flax that grew in the fields, light and white and cool. Men wore a kilt about the waist, women wore straight, elegant dresses. Both loved ornament, and wore jewelry according to their wealth, from simple beads of clay and faience to collars of gold and precious stones. They lined their eyes with dark paint, not only for beauty but to shield them from the glare and the flies, and they anointed their skin with scented oils against the dry heat. Cleanliness was prized above almost everything. Even the poor washed often in the river, and the rich bathed daily, for to be clean was, to the Egyptians, to be close to the gods. Their family life was warm, and, by the measures of the ancient world, remarkably fair to women. An Egyptian woman could own property and run a business and inherit and bequeath wealth, and go to court in her own name, rights that women in many later ages and other lands would not have. Marriages seem often to have been made for love as much as arrangement, and the tomb paintings show husbands and wives sitting close together, embracing, sharing a meal, walking hand in hand, hoping to remain together in the life beyond as they had been in this one. They adored their children and mourned them terribly when they were lost, for many children died young. They kept pets, dogs and cats and monkeys and geese, and buried them, sometimes, beside their masters. And they knew how to enjoy their leisure. They loved music and singing and dancing and told stories in the evenings. They played games, above all a board game called Senet, a game of pieces moved across 30 squares according to the throw of casting sticks, which was so beloved that they played it in the streets and in the palaces alike, and painted it on their tomb walls, and placed sets of it in their graves, for they imagined the dead playing it too, in the life beyond, the pieces moving across the board as the soul moved across the squares of the afterlife toward its rest. Children played with wooden toys, with balls and dolls and little animals whose jaws or tails could be made to move, with spinning tops and carved figures, the same simple delights that children have always known. It was, for all its strangeness to our eyes, a deeply human world, full of the same small pleasures and comforts that fill our own days, and that is perhaps why it reaches across the gulf of so many thousands of years and touches us still. Let us imagine, then, a single ordinary day in that world, and let it lull you toward sleep. It begins before dawn, in the cool gray light, when the village stirs. A farmer rises from his mat on the roof, where he has slept beneath the fading stars, and comes down into the still dark house. His wife has risen already, and is grinding the grain for the day's bread, and blowing the embers of the fire back to life. He eats a little bread, an onion, drinks a mouthful of beer, and goes out into the fields as the first gold touches the top of the eastern desert. The air is cool and sweet. Birds are waking in the reeds. He works through the gentle hours of the morning, guiding the water along its channels, tending the young green shoots, while the sun climbs slowly up the wide blue sky. By midday the heat lies heavy on the land, and work slows, and people rest in the shade through the worst of it, dozing, talking quietly, waiting for the cool of the afternoon. Then work resumes, and the long golden hours slide by, until the sun begins at last to sink toward the western hills. The farmer turns homeward as the light grows rich and slanting, his shadow stretching long before him. The evening meal is shared in the doorway as the sky turns to flame and rose. Neighbors call greetings. Children are gathered in. And as the swift Egyptian dusk comes down, the family climbs once more to the roof and lies down beneath the emerging stars, in the warm, still air, listening to the last sounds of the village settling into quiet, and to the eternal soft voice of the river nearby. And sleep comes easily, as it came to them every night of their lives, under the same stars that shine still, a good and simple weariness after a good and simple day. So it was night after night, for thousands upon thousands of nights, for hundreds of generations of ordinary people, beside that patient and unchanging river. They were, too, among the finest physicians of the ancient world, and doctors came from far-off lands to learn the Egyptian arts of healing. Their doctors set broken bones and stitched wounds and knew a great many remedies drawn from plants and minerals, some of which truly worked. They wrote medical texts that survive to this day, careful observations of illness and injury, some of them astonishingly rational and modern in their approach. Alongside this practical medicine ran magic and prayer, spells against disease and amulets for protection, for to the Egyptian mind there was no sharp line between the two. But the best of their physicians observed, and recorded and reasoned, in a way that would not be seen again for a very long time. And they were great keepers of time and watchers of the sky. It was the Egyptians who gave the world a calendar of 365 days, divided into 12 months, the foundation of the calendar we still use today. They divided the day and the night into hours. They watched the star we call Sirius, whose reappearance in the dawn sky each year announced the coming of the flood, and built their whole year around it. At night, upon the desert, the stars burned with a brilliance we can scarcely imagine in our lit-up world, and the Egyptians knew them well, and set them into their myths, and aligned their great pyramids to them with breathtaking precision. To lie upon a rooftop in ancient Egypt and look up was to see the very body of the sky goddess, arched above the world, her stars scattered across her like jewels. And binding all of this together was their writing, the sacred hieroglyphs. It was one of the first writing systems ever invented, born more than 5,000 years ago, and it was, to the Egyptians, a gift of the god Thoth, and a sacred and powerful thing. Those beautiful little pictures, the owl and the reed and the water ripple and the seated man, were not mere decoration. They were words and sounds and the Egyptians believed that to write a thing was, in a way, to make it real, and to write a name was to give it a kind of life. That is why they carved their names so deeply and so often into the stone, so that they should never be forgotten, for to be forgotten, to have your name erased, was a second and a final death. And it is why, when they wished truly to destroy an enemy, they chiseled his name away from the walls, to unmake him from history itself. For always, in every corner of Egyptian life, there was the thought of eternity. No people in all of history prepared for death so carefully or so hopefully as the Egyptians. They did not build such tombs because they were gloomy or afraid. They built them because they believed, with their whole hearts, that life was good, and that it could go on, that a person who had lived well and been properly buried would pass into a life beyond as real and as pleasant as this one, a land of green fields beside an eternal Nile, where they would farm and feast and love and be young again forever. The tomb was not a place of ending. It was a doorway, and a home for the soul to return to, and a storehouse of everything one might need for the journey and the life beyond. And so they perfected the art of preserving the body, the art we call mummification, over many long centuries. It was slow and sacred work, and it took 70 days. First, the embalmers removed the parts that would decay, the inner organs, drawing them out and preserving them separately in special jars, each watched over by a protecting god, though the heart they left in place, for the heart was the seat of the mind and the soul, and it would be needed for the weighing. Then they covered the body in a natural salt from the desert, and left it to dry for many weeks, until all the moisture was gone. Then it was washed and anointed with sweet oils and resins, and wrapped round and round, in hundreds of yards of fine linen, with precious amulets and charms laid between the layers, and sacred spells spoken over each one. And at last the wrapped body, in the likeness of Osiris himself, was laid within its painted coffin, ready for eternity. And they did not send their dead into the beyond unguided. They sent them with a book, which we call the Book of the Dead, a scroll of spells and prayers and instructions, placed in the tomb to help the soul on its dangerous journey through the underworld, past its monsters and its gates and its trials, to the hall of judgment and the weighing of the heart. It told the dead what to say, and how to answer and how to declare before the gods all the wrongs they had not done. I have not stolen, I have not lied, I have not caused anyone to weep, I have not killed. To pass, the heart had to be as light as the feather of truth. And if it was, then the god Osiris himself welcomed the soul into the eternal fields, and the long-prepared hope of a whole lifetime was, at last, fulfilled. It is from those tombs and their paintings that we know so much of how the Egyptians lived, for they covered the walls of their burial places with scenes of everyday life, farming and fishing, feasting and dancing, hunting in the marshes, tending cattle, baking bread, making wine, so that these good things might continue for the dead forever. And their art has a look all its own, unmistakable across 3,000 years, at once strange and beautiful. Figures are shown in a curious way, the head in profile but the eye and the shoulders facing forward, so that each part of the body is seen from its clearest angle. Size showed importance rather than distance. The pharaoh looms enormous, the great lord larger than his servants, so that a glance tells you at once who matters most. There is no shadow, no vanishing distance, no attempt to trick the eye into seeing depth. This was not because the Egyptians could not draw what they saw. It was because they were not painting a passing moment. They were painting the eternal truth of a thing, its clearest and most complete form, made to last forever. And so their art has a calm, timeless stillness to it, a serene and ordered beauty that suits perfectly a people who built for eternity, and it speaks to us still as clearly as it did to them across all the long ages between. And through it all, in every scene and every age, runs their deep and patient love of life. We sometimes think of the Egyptians as a people obsessed with death, because so much of what survives comes from their tombs. But the truth is nearly the opposite. They prepared so carefully for the life beyond precisely because they loved this life so dearly and could not bear the thought of losing it. Look at what they chose to carry into eternity. Not sorrow, but banquets and music, gardens and pools, the taste of good bread, the smell of lotus flowers, the company of husbands and wives and children and friends, the sun on the river, the birds rising from the reeds. Theirs was a civilization that looked upon the world and found it good, and wished more than anything for it never to end. And in a way it never has. For here we are, so many thousands of years later, still speaking of them, still moved by them, still carrying their images and their words and their dreams forward into a future they could never have imagined. The wish of every Egyptian heart to be remembered has, for their whole people, come wonderfully true. For nothing in this world lasts forever, not even Egypt, though it lasted longer than almost anything else that human beings have ever made. After the last great pharaohs, the kingdom entered its long, slow evening. The empire in Asia was lost. The central power weakened once more, and Egypt divided north from south. Foreign peoples settled and rose to power. For a time, kings from Libya ruled Egypt. For a time, kings from Nubia in the south, who revered the old Egyptian ways and restored the ancient temples. Egypt was still Egypt, still rich, still holy, still building and worshipping in the old manner. But it was no longer the master of the world, and new powers were rising beyond its borders that would, one by one, come to swallow it. First came the Assyrians, the fierce empire of the East, who invaded Egypt and sacked the great southern city of Thebes, carrying off its treasures. Egypt recovered and had one last bright flowering of independence, a final age when native pharaohs ruled and the old art and learning revived, looking back with longing to the glories of the old kingdom a full 2,000 years before. But then came a greater power still, the Persians, whose vast empire stretched across the whole of the East, and who conquered Egypt and made it a mere province of their realm, ruled by a distant foreign king. The throne of the pharaohs, which had stood for 3,000 years, now belonged to strangers who had never seen the Nile. And then, out of the north and west, came the man who would change the whole ancient world. Alexander, the young king of Macedon, the conqueror the world would call Alexander the Great, swept down through the east, shattering the Persian Empire, and in his march he came to Egypt. And the Egyptians, weary of their harsh Persian masters, welcomed him not as a conqueror but as a liberator. He went to the ancient sacred places and honored the old gods, and the priests hailed him as pharaoh, as the son of the gods in the old way. And upon the shore of the sea, where the Nile met the Mediterranean, he founded a new city and gave it his own name, Alexandria. He did not live to see it built. He marched on to further conquests and died young, far away, and his vast empire was torn apart among his generals. Egypt fell to one of those generals, a shrewd and capable man named Ptolemy, who took it for his own and made himself its king, and founded a line of Greek pharaohs who would rule Egypt for the next 300 years. These were the Ptolemies, and they were a strange blend of two worlds. They were Greek in language and in blood, and they built Alexandria into the most brilliant city of the age, its harbor crowned by that towering white lighthouse, one of the wonders of the world, its halls holding that famous library, which set out to gather every book that had ever been written, and drew to itself the greatest scholars and scientists and poets of the age. Yet the Ptolemies also ruled as pharaohs in the old Egyptian style, worshipped the Egyptian gods, and built some of the finest and best preserved temples that still stand along the Nile today. For 3 centuries this Greek dynasty ruled the ancient land, growing, in the end, weak and quarrelsome and torn by murder within the royal family. But let us dwell a little longer on Alexandria in its glory, for it was one of the most extraordinary cities the world has ever seen, and its light shone for centuries. It was a Greek city set upon Egyptian soil, planned in broad straight avenues along the shore of the sea, gleaming with white marble palaces and temples and colonnades. Out in its great double harbor rose the lighthouse, the Pharos, a tower of pale stone climbing higher than any building the world had known save the pyramids themselves, with a great fire burning at its summit by night and a polished mirror flashing the sunlight by day, guiding ships in from far out at sea. It was counted one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and it stood for many centuries, until the earthquakes of a later age at last threw it down into the waves. But the truest wonder of Alexandria was not made of stone. It was the library and the great house of learning attached to it, which the Ptolemies founded with a magnificent ambition, to gather into one place every book that had ever been written, in every language from every land. Their agents combed the world for scrolls, buying them, borrowing them, copying them, even, it is said, seizing them from every ship that came into the harbor to be copied before they were returned. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls filled its shelves, the largest collection of knowledge that had ever existed, and to it came the finest minds of the age, drawn by the Ptolemies' wealth to study and to teach and to think all together in one place. And what they achieved there still astonishes us. In Alexandria, a mathematician named Euclid wrote the book of geometry that would be studied and taught to school children for more than 2,000 years, down to our own time. In Alexandria, a scholar named Eratosthenes, using nothing but shadows and angles and careful reasoning, measured the size of the whole round earth and got the answer very nearly right, at a time when most of the world did not even know the earth was round. There, astronomers mapped the stars and tracked the planets. There, physicians studied the human body and advanced the art of medicine. There, engineers and inventors built marvelous machines. For a few glorious centuries, Alexandria was the beating heart of learning for the whole ancient world, the place where the light of knowledge burned brightest. And though the library itself would in later ages be lost, damaged and dwindling until its great collection was gone, much of what its scholars discovered survived, copied and carried onward, to light the way for every age that followed. And so at last we come to her, the final ruler of independent Egypt, the last pharaoh of them all, Cleopatra. She was a Ptolemy, Greek by descent, but she loved Egypt as none of her family had, and she alone among all her line troubled to learn the Egyptian language, and presented herself to her people as the living image of the goddess Isis. She was clever and learned, and spoke many tongues, and possessed a charm and a force of will that the ancient writers could not stop describing. She came to a throne that was already in the shadow of a greater power, for by now the true master of the world was Rome, and Egypt survived only so long as Rome allowed it. Cleopatra's whole reign was a desperate, brilliant struggle to keep her ancient kingdom free, in a world where Rome swallowed everything. And her weapons in that struggle were her wit, her wealth, and her alliances with the most powerful men of Rome. Her story reads like a legend, and yet it is history. She came to the throne as a young woman, sharing it with a younger brother, as the custom of her family demanded, and quickly the two of them fell to quarreling, until her brother's supporters drove her from the palace and out of the capital. She might have vanished from history then. But at that very moment, the greatest Roman of the age arrived in Egypt, Julius Caesar, master of Rome's legions, come in pursuit of his defeated rivals. And Cleopatra saw her chance. The story is famous and may even be true, that to reach Caesar past the guards of her enemies in the palace, she had herself smuggled and wrapped inside a rolled-up carpet, or a sack of bedding, carried on a servant's shoulder, and unrolled before the astonished Roman general in his own chambers. However she came to him, she won him utterly. Caesar took her side, restored her to her throne, and stayed with her through a winter in Egypt, and she bore him a son, whom she named Caesarion, Little Caesar. For a moment, bound to the most powerful man in the world, Cleopatra's Egypt seemed safe. But it did not last. Caesar returned to Rome, and there, a few years later, he was struck down and murdered by his own senators, and Cleopatra's great protector was gone. Into the storm that followed Caesar's death, she cast her lot with another great Roman, Mark Antony, one of the two men who now divided the Roman world between them. Their meeting, too, became a legend. How she sailed to him up a river in a barge with gilded stern and purple sails and silver oars, dressed as the goddess of love, amid music and perfume, so that word ran through the crowds that the goddess herself had come to feast with Antony. He was captivated as Caesar had been, and more. He came to Alexandria, and there the two of them lived, for a few years, in a blaze of splendor and love and reckless magnificence that the ancient world never forgot, feasting and playing and dreaming of a great Eastern empire of their own, with Egypt at its heart. Together they had children. Together they made a power in the East that might, they hoped, stand strong enough to stand alone. But against them stood the cold, patient, calculating young heir of Caesar, his adopted son Octavian, who ruled the west of the Roman world, and who would one day be called Augustus and become the first emperor of Rome. Octavian was everything Antony was not, careful where Antony was rash, calculating where Antony was passionate, and he wanted the whole Roman world for himself. Slowly, cleverly, he turned Rome against Antony and Cleopatra, painting Antony as a man bewitched and unmanned by a foreign queen, a Roman who had betrayed Rome for the arms of an Eastern sorceress. And at last it came to open war between them, a war for the mastery of the entire world, West against East, Rome against Egypt, Octavian against the lovers of Alexandria. It ended at sea, off the western coast of Greece, at a place called Actium, where the great fleets came together in a battle for the mastery of the world. It was a confused and terrible day upon the water, and in the midst of it, for reasons the histories still argue over, the tide of the fighting turned against Antony and Cleopatra. Cleopatra's ships broke away and fled south for home, and Antony, seeing her go, abandoned his own fleet and followed her, and the battle was lost. It was the ruin of all their hopes. They fled back to Egypt with the slow, sure power of Rome closing in behind them, and there was nothing now that could save them, only a little time left, and the manner of their ending to decide. Octavian came on toward Alexandria, patient and unstoppable, and one by one Antony's soldiers and allies slipped away to the winning side. And so, with all hope gone and the enemy at the gates of the city, the two lovers chose how they would die. Antony, hearing a false report that Cleopatra was already dead, fell upon his own sword and died, the histories say, in her arms after all, the report having been untrue. And Cleopatra, left alone, a captive in her own palace, was determined that she would not be carried off to Rome to be paraded in chains through its streets as a trophy of Octavian's triumph, the last pharaoh of Egypt led in humiliation for the crowds to jeer at. She was a queen and a goddess to her people, and she would die as one. And so, the legend tells, she dressed herself in her royal robes and her crown, and arranged herself upon a golden couch, and had brought to her, hidden in a basket of figs, an asp, a venomous serpent, the sacred cobra that reared upon the very crown of Egypt's kings. She pressed it to her arm or to her breast, and its bite carried her gently out of the world, and when Octavian's men burst in, they found her already dead, laid out in her royal splendor, beyond his reach forever, with her faithful servants dying beside her. She was 39 years old, and she had reigned for 22 years, and she was the last pharaoh of Egypt. After 3,000 years, the line that had begun with the first king who joined the two lands came at last to its end, with a Greek queen who loved Egypt, dying by the sacred serpent's kiss rather than yield her ancient kingdom's dignity to Rome. With her death, the throne of Egypt, which had endured for 3,000 years, came to its end. Egypt became a province of Rome, ruled from a distant city, its grain feeding the Roman people, its ancient glory now only a memory. And so Egypt became a Roman province, the personal possession of the emperor, valued above all for one thing: its grain. The same rich fields that had fed the pharaohs now fed the vast city of Rome, and the ships sailed each year from Alexandria laden with Egyptian wheat to keep the Roman people fed. The pharaoh was gone, but Egypt labored on, its wealth flowing now to a distant master across the sea. And the Romans, like everyone who came to Egypt, fell under its spell. Roman emperors had themselves carved on the temple walls in the dress of pharaohs, making offerings to the Egyptian gods in the old style, their names written in hieroglyphs inside the royal ovals, the last in that unbroken line of god-kings stretching back 3,000 years. Roman tourists carved their names on the ancient monuments, exactly as visitors would do in every later age, and marveled at the pyramids, already unimaginably old. And yet Egypt did not truly vanish, not all at once. The temples still stood. The people still lived along the river as they always had, farming the black soil, watching the flood. For a few more centuries the old religion lingered, growing slowly weaker, until at last a great new faith spread across the Roman world and into Egypt, and the old gods, worshipped for more than 3,000 years, were left behind at last. The temples were closed by order of the emperors, or fell silent for want of worshippers. And there came a day, though no one knew it was the last, when a priest at a remote southern temple carved a line of hieroglyphs into the stone, the final inscription in that sacred writing, the last words in a script that had been written for 3,500 years. After him, no one carved them again. And within a few generations, the knowledge of how to read them was lost entirely, so completely that it would not be recovered for 1,000 years and more. For more than 1,000 years, no living person on earth could read a single line of the hieroglyphs. The tombs and temples still stood in the sand, covered in their beautiful writing, but it had become a silent riddle, a code that no one could break. Egypt had fallen asleep, and its very voice was locked away. It slept for a very long time. And then, slowly, the world began to remember it. Travelers came and marveled at the ruins that rose from the sand, and wondered at the beautiful writing that covered them, which no living soul could read. And then, a little over 200 years ago, the armies of France under the young General Napoleon came to Egypt, and though the campaign itself came to nothing, Napoleon had brought with him a small army of another kind. Scholars, artists, and scientists, more than 100 of them, who spread out across the land to measure and draw and record everything they saw. Their great work, published in many volumes over many years, revealed the wonders of Egypt to a spellbound Europe for the first time, and lit a fire of fascination that has never gone out. And in the course of that expedition came the greatest stroke of fortune of all. Near a town in the delta called Rosetta, soldiers repairing an old fort dug out a broken slab of dark stone, and someone with a sharp eye noticed that it was carved with writing, and not in one script but in 3, the same message, it seemed, written 3 times over. One of the 3 was the lost hieroglyphs. Another was a later Egyptian script. And the 3rd, at the bottom, was ancient Greek, which scholars could read perfectly well. If the 3 texts truly said the same thing, then here at last was a key, a way to unlock the silent picture writing by matching it against the Greek that anyone could read. The Rosetta Stone, as it came to be called, set the scholars of Europe racing to be the first to break the ancient code. It was harder than anyone expected, and it took more than 20 years. The one who at last succeeded was a Frenchman named Jean-François Champollion, who had fallen in love with Egypt as a small boy and had vowed as a child that he would one day read the hieroglyphs, and had spent his whole life preparing himself, learning language after language, ancient tongue after ancient tongue, to make himself ready. And working from the Rosetta Stone and from other inscriptions, slowly, painstakingly, he realized the secret that others had missed, that the little pictures were not simply symbols standing for whole ideas, but were, for the most part, signs standing for sounds, letters, in a way that spelled out the ancient words. When the full understanding broke upon him at last, the story goes that he rushed to his brother's office, flung down his papers, cried out that he had it, and collapsed in a faint from the sheer force of the discovery. He had done it. After a silence of 1,500 years, the hieroglyphs could be read again. The riddle was answered. The sleeping kingdom could speak and tell its own story in its own voice once more. After that, the discoveries came thick and fast, as scholars and adventurers poured into Egypt to read the writing on the walls and dig the treasures out of the sand, and museum by museum, the wonders of the ancient kingdom were carried off to be marveled at across the world. And the greatest single discovery of all came just over 100 years ago, and it belonged, fittingly, to that forgotten boy king whose small tomb had been overlooked by history. An Englishman named Howard Carter had spent years searching the Valley of the Kings for it, funded by a patient patron, and had very nearly given up hope, for the valley seemed long since emptied of its secrets, every tomb found and plundered. He resolved to try one last season. And almost at once, his workers uncovered a single step cut into the rock, hidden for millennia beneath the rubble and the huts of ancient workmen. They dug and found another step, and another, a whole staircase descending into the earth, and at its bottom, a sealed doorway, its ancient seals unbroken. Carter scarcely dared to hope. He sent for his patron to come from England, and waited, and then together they broke through into a passage filled with rubble, and cleared it, and came to a second sealed door. Carter made a small hole in the corner of it, and held up a candle, and put his eye to the opening, and looked through into a darkness that had not been disturbed for more than 3,000 years. And as the candle flame steadied, shapes began to emerge out of the gloom, the glint of gold, everywhere the glint of gold, strange animals and statues and treasures piled in wild profusion. For a long moment he was struck dumb, and his patron, unable to bear the silence, asked him whether he could see anything. And Carter answered at last the words that would echo around the world. Yes, wonderful things. It was the tomb of Tutankhamun, and it was very nearly whole, the only royal tomb of Egypt ever found with its treasure so nearly intact, packed with thousands of objects, chariots and thrones and beds and weapons and jewelry and shrine within golden shrine, and at the heart of it all, the young king himself in his nested coffins, his face covered by that magnificent mask of solid gold, serene and beautiful, that has become the very image of ancient Egypt. The whole world thrilled to the news. The newspapers were full of it. A wave of wonder at all things Egyptian swept across the earth. There was even talk of a curse, whispered when Carter's patron died not long after of an illness, dark rumors that the pharaoh took revenge on those who disturbed his rest, though Carter himself, who had done more disturbing than anyone, lived on for many quiet years. But curse or no curse, the meaning of it was clear enough. The boy king whose name his enemies had tried to erase from history had become, 3,000 years later, the most famous of all the pharaohs, his golden face known in every corner of the world. He had achieved, in the strangest way imaginable, the thing every Egyptian longed for above all else. He had been remembered. And so the sleeping kingdom woke, in our own age, into a fame greater than any it had known even in its living glory. Its treasures fill the museums of the world. Its river still flows as it always has, from the far south to the sea. Its great pyramids still stand upon the desert's edge at Giza, exactly where the builders raised them, still the oldest and the last surviving of all the wonders of the ancient world, still watching the sun go down. Empires have risen and fallen without number since the first pharaoh joined the two lands. And yet Egypt endures, in stone and in memory, a kingdom that reached for eternity, and, in its own strange way, very nearly grasped it. And its reach extends even into our own world, in ways we hardly notice. The very calendar we live by of 365 days descends from theirs. Great obelisks of Egyptian granite, carved for the pharaohs 3,000 years ago, stand today in the hearts of London and Paris and New York and Rome, carried across the seas by later ages that long to possess a piece of that ancient wonder. The image of the pyramid, the eye, the Sphinx, the scarab appear again and again in our art and our buildings and our stories. Every generation rediscovers Egypt and falls under its spell anew. The children who marvel at the golden mask, the travelers who stand speechless before the pyramids, the dreamers who gaze at the hieroglyphs and feel the pull of that unimaginable depth of time. No civilization has ever cast a longer shadow or held the human imagination more completely than this one kingdom beside its river. The Egyptians wished, above all things, to endure, to be remembered, never to be forgotten. And of all the peoples who have ever lived upon the earth, few have been remembered so long, or so well, or with such wonder as they. So let us end our long journey where we began it, upon the river, and let me carry you gently down it one last time, as sleep draws near. Imagine that you are aboard a small boat upon the Nile, in the golden age of Egypt, 3,000 years ago, and there is nothing you need to do but lie back and let the current carry you. The great sail hangs slack above you, and the boat drifts slowly with the river's own slow motion. The water laps softly against the hull. On either side, the green fields slide past, palm trees and reeds and the small figures of farmers at their patient work, tiny and far away. The air is warm and smells of water and of growing things and of wood smoke from a distant village. You pass beneath the walls of a great temple, its painted pylons glowing in the last light, and hear, faint across the water, the sound of a priest singing the evening hymn. You pass fishermen drawing in their nets, and cattle standing in the shallows, and children, small and safe on the bank, watching your boat go by. A heron lifts from the reeds on slow white wings. The sun sinks lower, and the whole river turns to molten gold, and then to deep rose, and then to violet, and the first stars begin to prick the darkening sky. And far off on the western shore, catching the very last of the light, you see the great pyramids, small with distance, standing exactly where they have always stood, keeping their silent watch over the sleeping land. The boat drifts on. There is nowhere you need to be. There is nothing left undone. There is only the river, and the warm night coming down, and the slow, sure motion of the water carrying you onward through the dark. So let that be our last thought tonight, as the embers dim and sleep draws near. Think of that patient river, running gold at dawn as it has run for 5,000 years and more. Think of the ordinary people beside it, planting and harvesting, baking their bread, raising their children, hoping, as we all hope, to be remembered. Think of the great calm face of the Sphinx, gazing out across the sand, keeping its long watch through all the ages of the world. There is a deep peace in things that endure, that were here long before us and will remain long after, that ask nothing of us but that we rest, for a little while, in their vast and quiet company. Think how many nights have fallen over that land, 5,000 years of nights and more, and how the stars have come out over the desert, each one of them, the same stars wheeling slowly over the same dark river, while kingdoms rose and fell beneath them. Think of all the countless people who have lain down to sleep beside that river, across all those ages, listening to the same soft sound of the water, watching the same stars, letting the same warm darkness carry them down into rest. You are one of them now, in your own way, joined across the ages to all who have ever found peace beside that ancient river. There is nothing you need to carry into sleep tonight. The great river has carried far heavier things than your cares, for far longer, and carried them gently, and let them go. So let it all go now, softly, as the light dies down. The day is over, and it is enough. The river runs on in the dark, as it always has, patient and unhurried and sure. The stars will slowly over the sleeping desert. The great pyramids stand silent upon the sand, keeping their long watch, as they have kept it through every night for 4,500 years, and will keep it still when this night too has passed. And all is well, and all is at peace, and there is nothing left for you to do now but let go, and grow still, and sink down softly into sleep. Rest now. Breathe slowly, and let each breath carry you deeper. Let your thoughts drift away like boats upon the river, out of sight, into the dark. Sleep deeply and sleep well. And may the deep calm of that timeless kingdom, the peace of the river and the desert and the ancient watching stars, go gently with you and stay with you all through the quiet night until the morning comes. Sleep now. Sleep and rest.